Okay, we're going to talk about the philosophy and the ideas of the Enlightenment era, where we get our concept of law and justice and legality and what is fair and how do we execute this from in America. So, our criminal system and our ideas really come from the British. And this Enlightenment movement that happens at the time in the 1700s is called uh, it was a group of philosophers that are really focused on trying to understand the physical world and society. And that's what we're zeroing in on. The study of the physical world by Enlightenment philosophers resulted in the scientific revolution. You guys take physical science classes like biology, physics, chemistry, all those classes to understand the physical world. Then they started to investigate the social world, society, human beings, and what is just in these ideas. We now study the physical world by testing hypotheses and establishing theories. Now, we look at some of these theories and ideas from the time, and one of the big challenges of the Enlightenment philosophers is they were theorizing on abstract ideas like right and wrong, and also they're making assumptions and coming to conclusions not necessarily based on good science or accurate understanding of the brain and psychology, for example, as we have today. However, it was groundbreaking that they're even thinking like this. The person that had all the power and was just was the king until this point. Now, in social science, the Enlightenment philosophers really start investigating these ideas further and further and further. They start challenging the idea of society and start questioning the role of government and law and what is just and fair. So, social science is the study of humans, and that's what we do. We study people in this course as opposed to the physical world. So, the classes you could take in social science are psychology, the study of the mind, human and animal behavior, sociology, the study of societies and the interactions between the classes across the board. You have anthropology, which is the study of human beings and our ancestors over time, and it goes on. History is the study of the past. Government is the study of leadership of, and we talk about crime and law as the study of what's legal and just. Up until the Enlightenment, most governments assumed that justice was through the king and the monarchy. So the king or queen, or the prince and princesses, and the dukes and duchesses were the monarch, and the monarchs got their power from God. So there was no questioning of the king's power. It was just. He is God. He is a representative of God on earth. So the king would execute somebody. He did it because God was inspiring him to do the right, just actions. And a monarchy is just a king or an emperor, an absolute ruler. And this idea dominates civilized worlds until just recently. Civilization led to monarchs for the most part, with some exceptions. The Greeks and the Romans would have democracy, and they would have direct democracy and a republic that's going to really influence America and our justice system. But for the most part, in England, which really starts pushing back on this, and these Enlightenment philosophers, it was a monarchy. The king had absolute rule. And the system they had at the time was feudalism. It's when the government, the people, or the serfs are controlled by a hierarchy. So the king is above all, his power comes from God. Then the dukes and duchesses are in charge of the serfs, and the lords all have pieces of land that the king has given to them, or it's through some kind of contract, and they're in control of these serfs, but they also have responsibilities to make sure they don't at least starve. And that was justice at the time. Locke and these other Enlightenment philosophers are going to really challenge this. And Locke writes a book called Essays in Human Understanding. And he tries to really understand human nature and investigate why do we create laws, and what are just laws, and how should governments rule. And he starts making some interesting arguments. In a lot of ways, this is the beginning of psychology, or the study of human behavior as we know it today, because Locke is going to say, look, he makes this argument that people are a blank slate. He also argues that people are born good, and he believes strongly in a God, and that people were born good and their soul's good, and then they come to Earth and they're a blank slate, or a tabarasa, which is this idea that they have nothing on the pages of their book, nothing on the slate or the chalkboard or the whiteboard as we have in classes. And they don't know good or bad. They don't know what's wrong or right. And it has to be taught to them through society and their parents. And we're all products of those societies. So if you teach somebody that murdering is good, they will think there's nothing wrong with murdering. And there's been cultures in the world where murdering was not necessarily wrong. For example, the Aztecs would sacrifice people they had captured, usually in battle, and to the gods to have a good season of maize where the corn would grow and they'd have enough food to feed people. And they thought it was necessary to make sacrifices of humans. There's been cultures that sacrificed animals, and they didn't know any better, and that's how they saw right or wrong. And he argued that this is what really makes a person, is our blank slate. And it's shaped with our experience and our perceptions. If people treat you well, you'll be nice and treat people well. If people are mean to you, then you might be mean and treat people mean. And this was his assumptions and arguments. Locke also starts really challenging the idea of government and the role of government as just a king. He says no one can be subjugated to the political power of another without his consent. So, subjugate means overpowered or dominated or ruled, and then without his consent, which means you yourself are allowing somebody to rule you. So the kings were ruling not only by our consent, because people were allowing them and saying, well, yeah, because God said so. And he's saying, no, governments and the people need to work together and come to some agreement on what is justice. And that we should make decisions based on an idea of an approach like the scientific method of rationalism. That we should make laws and determine what's right or wrong in a society based on reason and logic. Very much like we look at the physical world. We have a scientific method, we test our hypothesis, and that was very much a part of how government should approach things. We should test a law, and if it doesn't work or it doesn't help the citizens in a country, then maybe we should change the law. And the government starts getting their power from the people. And he also says that people, as we discussed, are born with these ideas of natural rights. And this is where rights really start as we know it in America. And also we've talked about human rights. So under the Declaration of Human Rights in the world, you still have rights worldwide, even if you're not in a country itself. And he says that the rights that we actually have, and a right is something you're born with, are life, liberty, and property. He says we're born with life, liberty, and property. Now, life meaning nobody could take your life or kill you or maybe hurt you without a just reason. Liberty, we're going to go into this concept of liberty, is this idea you could do what you want as long as you're not affecting or hurting other people. As long as your rights aren't walking on other people's rights, that's not usually a liberty issue. And that gets very complicated. And that's a big debate on what does that mean. So if you say it's a liberty issue for smoking cigarettes, for example. So smoking cigarettes, most people might argue, well, yeah, but you're smoking a cigarette, you're just hurting yourself. So smoking cigarettes should be legal. If somebody wants to hurt themselves and smoke cigarettes and it's bad for you, bad for them, that's not my issue. However, society has really changed the expectations on liberty with smoking cigarettes. When I was a kid, people could smoke indoors all over the place. I remember they had like an ashtray and an elevator. People could smoke in the elevators. And I'm not that old, but the idea, we had smoking lounges at high school, and the students could go smoke with the teachers at lunch or take a break. That stuff is all gone because liberty's changed. People saw smoking as just kind of, it hurts yourself. But with science, we found out that smoking affects everybody around you. You cause secondhand smoke and increase the likeliness that they get lung cancer. So you doing smoking cigarettes does affect others around you, your children, and so forth and so on. So the question is, uh, at what point should somebody be free to smoke a cigarette, and at what point shouldn't they? Should they be allowed to smoke cigarettes outside? Well, that doesn't maybe affect people very much. But what if they have children? Can they smoke in their own house? And if they have children, wouldn't that affect the children? So these are really good questions. And he also pushes this idea of property. Property is very much a Western idea. It's this idea that comes out of Europe that we can somehow own things and that we have to protect the ownership of what we own. And we own things not necessarily just because the king says so, because we somehow earn it, or we bought it, or we use money. And this is very influential, and you can even see this in the Declaration of Independence in America, because Thomas Jefferson argues that all men are created equal, and we have a right to life, liberty, and he changes the property, that we're not entitled to property, but a pursuit of happiness. And this leads to other ideas. What do we have to give people to be just and make sure they have a right to pursue happiness? Well, I would obviously argue education gives you the ability to pursue happiness. You can be what you want to be, or you could get trained in a job so you can make lots of money if that's what you want to achieve. But you have to have the foundation, the background to achieve those goals. And we have to give you the ability to pursue it. And then you choose at that point what to do. Locke also believed in separation of church and state, and we'll talk about these concepts of should we keep government separate from religion? Also, should we keep religion separate from government? Should the government not interfere with people's religious beliefs? However, should religion not influence the way we rule government? Because if you believe in rationalism, we should rule government based on logic and reasoning, not religious beliefs or a religious belief or even several religious beliefs. And a counter argument would be, well, yeah, but in America, most people are Christian or Judeo-Christians. So they believe in Christian and Jewish ideas. So shouldn't we base our laws on that? And the Enlightenment philosophers would say probably not. You should keep those things separate. If a law is hurting people, we should stop it. Or if it goes against people's rights, we should not enact it, which means put it in the role. So it's very important to keep these institutions separate, and that government should be doing what's best for the people. And this goes back to Socrates and Plato and all the ancient Greeks, that we should make decisions based on logic and reasoning instead of just what we think is a good idea. Like give somebody 20 years for a murder. Why? Why is 20 years the right number? Well, it gives them enough time to think about it. Does it? Is that actually based on research and science? Or are we just making up numbers? We've talked about like when a human is actually 25 years of age, they can actually be old enough to make their brain is fully developed and make their own decisions, good or bad. I think you have a pretty strong argument in science that before somebody's 25, they really don't have a developed brain, and they probably don't think the same as somebody that's 25 or up. And their choices are maybe based more on emotion and can be more irrational or hormonal. Now, Rousseau is also really builds with Locke on this idea of what he calls a social contract. And this is a description that the people and the government should work together. And a social contract of the government is created to serve the people and to protect our liberties, to keep us safe, and to make sure your rights are safe. And it's a two-way street. The government does all these things to protect us, like they have to create a law enforcement and a military to make sure we're safe from being attacked by other countries and that our rights are safe from other countries, and police to keep us safe from each other. And certain individuals that won't honor the social contract and liberty, that don't care that in society we agree you own your cell phone. That is your cell phone, and nobody has a right to take it. And somebody still will take it, and there has to be consequences, and the government has to get involved, is the idea. And in the social contract, like Locke had said, the people, power comes from the people. And then again, Locke and Rousseau really hammer this idea of it's all based on liberty. And liberty is this belief that a person would give up some of your individual freedoms for the betterment of our society. So we don't have freedom in America. That's not true. When people say that, and especially government leaders, are not really being honest. If you had freedom, you could do whatever you want, whenever you want. We have liberty, which means you could do what you want as long as you're not stepping on other people's rights. And that's where the arguments come in. What should be legal and not legal? And then other issues come into it, like justice. And we talk about these idea of, is justice enacted, or is it effectively given to people, or are dished out equally? Do we treat everybody just? Does everybody get a shot? Should justice be based on fairness? If you have somebody with Down syndrome, should they get the same consequences as a 27-year-old grown man? If you have somebody that's mentally ill and they act out, should the police handle them the same way as, again, a 27-year-old man that has no mental health illness? Maybe not. Maybe you have to deal with these situations differently, and their rights are the same, but the consequences and the way we approach things have to be different. Just like in school, we have to treat students different based on their needs. That's the idea of fairness. And it's all about protecting everybody's natural rights of life, liberty, and what Locke calls property, or pursuing happiness, as Jefferson put it. And that's the government's role. So Rousseau is the last guy we're going to talk about. And Rousseau also argues that this idea, he calls it popular sovereignty. And that's really what we're getting at. Popular sovereignty is this idea that people are ultimately the authority in the government, and it's theirs to carry out the laws. Popular sovereignty is, we give the power to the government and they do the just things. If they don't do something just, through democracy and republicanism, which is what we have, we vote for our federal government and we can fire them if they're doing a terrible job. That is the main idea to popular sovereignty. We have the power. Now, Montesquieu takes it a step further, and this really shapes how to be just, how the government should be set up. And he argues, his name is Charles Louis de Secondet, or Baron de Montesquieu is what most people call him, is this idea during the Enlightenment that we should break the government into three branches. And he comes up with this idea called separation of powers. He writes it in his book, The Spirit of the Laws, in 1748. And this is very influential on American government. Remember, this is only about 20 or 30 years before America becomes a country. And he argues you should have an executive, which is the president or the enforcer or prime minister, the police, military under the executive. You have the legislative branch, or the Congress or Parliament in Britain. In Congress, they make up the laws. And then finally, you have the judicial branch, which we're going to spend a lot of time focused on. And they are the ones that interpret the laws. So the legislator makes the laws. The enforcers, the executive branch, enforces the laws, regardless if they like them or not. And then the judges have to interpret to make sure that they are being followed and executed justly. He believed that the government would have different branches, such as an executive, judicial, and legislative, as we just described. And then it gets more complicated. In America, we'll talk in government, you'll go into James Madison, really argues that not only should the branches be separate, but they should check each other. And in America, our branches are relatively balanced and they check each other. And that's not necessarily the case in other countries. They'll have a separate, but the fact that Montesquieu says we should separate them is very important. Remember, before the Enlightenment, the king was the executor. He had the military and the army to go kill and arrest people. He was the legislator. He made the laws that you would follow. He would raise taxes. And then finally, he was the judge, or he would tell people who to judge for him. And he would say, off with his head. So he was the judicial, the legislator, and the executive. That all changed with the Enlightenment period. And that's what we're going to focus on.